Hello and welcome to Module 6. This one's a mouthful. It's collecting evidence to facilitate feedback and reflection, part 2. Part 2 is going to be very similar to part 1. This time, though, we're refining our evidence collection. We're going to revisit inside those observations. We're also, though, going to take a dive into that pre-conference and think about how the pre-conference sets up our evidence collection and really is going to then connect to the self-assessment after the actual classroom observation. When we look at the overall learning map for our class, we are still on our third week, really focusing on the components and the measures of an inclusive evaluation process. This week, we are going to be looking again at observations. We are also going to touch on teacher identified goals, and we are going to be connecting observations to student outcomes. This is part 2 of really focusing on collecting evidence in the observation process. And the reason why we're going to be spending 2 weeks on collecting evidence is because evidence is the foundation for self-assessment and our next topic, which is objective feedback. So again, collecting reliable and valid and relevant evidence is a really critical part to be able to self-assess about practice and to be able to provide objective feedback. So we're going to touch on those same topics that we talked about last week, which is collecting very detailed and descriptive information about teachers' actions, student actions. We're going to focus a little bit more on content. We want our evidence collection to be valid, reliable, and equally important, reasonable and manageable. And in order to do that, we are going to refine and continue to develop our own process or ideas about how we would go about collecting evidence as part of an evaluation system. We have 4 main objectives for this module, very similar to last week, just a little bit different. We're going to review, so we're still in evaluation components, and we're connecting those components to the reflective cycle because that's an important part of supporting continuous growth in teaching practice. This week, though, we're going to move outside of observations. We're going to talk about the pre-conference and how that fits into the process. And we're going to start to touch on self-assessment, but that will be more of a focus next week. The second objective is to become more specific and focused in identifying and defining what evidence we're going to collect during different types of observations. We're going to review different ways to strategically collect evidence. And all 3 of those things ultimately lead to accurate and effective assessment of teaching practice. And we're as evaluators, as leaders, we are trying to facilitate reflection and provide feedback to support growth. I've reviewed all of the week 4 evaluation component analyses. Every single one of you recognized that the components of teacher evaluation, when implemented well, do support the continuous and growth and improvement of teacher practice. Each of you identified how each component serves a different purpose. Several of you also identified that there's value when you connect those different components to the teacher's professional goal. Some of the themes or the main themes that emerged from the Model 4 applications, first and foremost, was that idea that teacher goal setting is valuable. and it deserves time, attention, and feedback throughout the year, both on the part of the teacher and the evaluator. A few of you connected this directly to teacher agency. And teacher agency in the research is that's your ultimate goal. We want to develop individual teachers who are confident in solving and initiating the solving of their own issues and problems that arise, and at the same time take the initiative in continuously growing and learning more about their practice. So agency is our ultimate goal. The second theme that emerged from your application assignments was that the pre-conference definitely has value, that people see how a face-to-face pre-conference can make a difference in the formal observation process, yet it's challenging to schedule. And so we are going to talk about some strategies and systems that you can put in place to make this a doable component. And then the third theme was that when done consistently and with commitment, evaluation, especially those informal observations, can build trust and relationships with teachers. And some of you connected this to the Wallace Foundation recommendation that effective principals, they secure the buy-in of staff in the evaluation process, and that in order to really leverage feedback through evaluation, teachers have to perceive that feedback as credible, and that consistency in the implementation of the process does lead to credibility. And then finally, a theme that emerged that had impact on my practice this week as a director was the recognition that leaders, principals, and administrators that are implementing and giving feedback and leading the evaluation process, they deserve ongoing support and feedback to continuously improve their practices. And so thank you. This has just reaffirmed and reinforced to me the importance of providing that. And I'm really thinking through what systems can I put in place that are reasonable to support evaluators, and just always getting better at what they do and giving them the opportunity to reflect and receive feedback. When it came to the question about student outcomes and value added evaluation, it was no surprise that nobody in our class was behind the value added or high stakes evaluation system that's connected to standardized test scores. That no value added system should be a standalone, or student achievement should never be a standalone in determining job status. Now, I am pleased to see that people did recognize and acknowledge that student outcomes are a really important part of our work. Like, that's the purpose of public education, is to assure that our students each year are growing academically. Ultimately, though, we're accountable that they're meeting grade level standards as articulated and identified by our State Board of Education. And so, so people said that that's important, but it should be outside of the evaluation process. And I didn't really read any specific ways that could be done outside of like student learning objectives. And so two things I want you to think about, like, so let's connect continuous improvement, which everybody's required to do as part of Rule 10. That's the whole point of continuous improvement. So continuous improvement, or MTSS, is evaluating your core instruction or the effectiveness of your core instruction. So we can do it collectively by looking at the achievement across our schools. So how effective is our core instruction? Are 80% of our students meeting grade level standards through core instruction? How effective is that? I also think that the formal observation is another opportunity on a smaller scale, for teachers and for evaluators to assess the effectiveness of instruction. In the pre-conference, a teacher identifies what the student learning target is for that lesson and also identifies a success criteria. So, what will the student say or do to demonstrate that they've met that learning target? And so, on a smaller scale, I do think that the formal observation does lend itself for an objective view, or an opportunity for both evaluator and teacher to assess the effectiveness of instruction. Okay, so our focus moving forward, week number 6, is pretty similar to module number 5. We're still looking at how we implement the components of evaluation, and we're looking at how we implement those components to strategically collect evidence inside and outside the observation. So the components we're really going to focus on this week are pre-conference and the observations. So informal, informal. So we're adding the pre-conference as another component for us to inform our evidence collection. Then the second thing that I want us to do is just continue to practice. So we're going to revisit and refine the purpose and processes used to collect evidence strategically to support the continuous improvement of individual teacher practice and collective teacher practice across the school. The only article that we are going to be referencing this week is the same article that you read for last week. Last week, I really emphasized narrowing your evidence collection during your observations. This week, when you reread this article or connect it to your observations, I want you to be thinking about we're not just assessing how things are being taught in the classroom, which a lot of times we watch the teacher and we record a bunch of information about what the teacher is doing and what strategies they're using. We also have to look at what is being taught. And by what, I'm talking about content. And so, does the content being taught, does it reflect and match the rigor of the state standard of that grade level expectation? And so you start there, and you really have to know and have a deep understanding of what that grade level standard is. And then while you're looking at that lesson, you are assessing, do those tasks and assessments and the things that we're having students do they align and match that level of expectation or rigor? Your district might be focusing on this. I went to the Nebraska curriculum directors and instructional leader conference last week, and overwhelmingly, the majority of districts represented, and there were 83 there, are focusing on that very thing this year, is rigor in the classroom and ensuring that the tasks we're giving students, the questions that we're asking them, are at that grade level of rigor. Okay, so this slide is going to come up very many times, and I did provide this feedback to a few of you when I responded to your accessing prior knowledge for Module 5, and that is really emphasizing that evidence is the foundation for reflection and feedback. I think a lot of times we jump right to feedback, and feedback is very, very important. And we're going to start learning more about giving effective feedback next week. But before we get there, I really want to re-emphasize and refocus on collecting valid and reliable and relevant evidence is the foundation for that. And it's twofold. The evidence supports the teacher in making an accurate self-assessment, and the ability to reflect on their classroom practice. Teachers are attending to a million things in their classroom. New teachers especially miss some of the things that are going on. Evaluation is the opportunity to be able to provide a teacher with valid, reliable, objective evidence to inform their assessment of their own practice and the impact it's having on student outcomes. The evidence is also important in supporting the evaluator's assessment of practice and how the evaluator is going to provide feedback. Credibility is really important in a teacher receiving feedback from an evaluator. Therefore, it's really critical that that evidence is objective, descriptive, concrete, and timely for the teacher. So our focus is evidence. We want to jump to feedback, but we're really focusing on collecting evidence. We support the continuous improvement of practice by engaging teachers and administrators in a process of self-reflection. And the process of self-reflection we're using for this class has 4 steps. And so I'm going to take us back and revisit how the components of the evaluation system support a reflective cycle to support the improvement of practice. The first part of a reflective cycle is awareness of instructional reality. And so that's when the teacher is able to accurately reflect on who their students are and what their students' needs are academically, behaviorally, socially, and in terms of executive function. That a teacher is able to accurately identify what the learning target is for that particular lesson and how that fits into the overall unit, and then grade level standards or expectations. And finally, the most important part is that the teacher is aware of instructional strategies that are most effective in supporting students in their learning and meeting those targets. The only place that we can really capture that thinking for a teacher is in a pre-observation, reflection, and meeting. And so, one thing that was identified as a challenge to evaluation is time to have those meetings. So a question that I've posed to the principals in District 145 is, how will you structure your pre-observation conferences? So that's our first chunk of focus for this week, is a pre-conference routine. The first part of a pre-conference is a teacher completing a pre-conference form. And for administrators, it's important to set expectations and to go over what those expectations are every single year. You see, for some teachers, once they're permanent, they may only fill out the pre-observation form once every 3 years. So it is really important to go through what the expectations are in completing each of these questions. And so the questions that are outlined in green, they connect to the learning target, how that learning target fits into the overall unit of study. And one expectation I have is, I want to know, what is the state standard? What are the standards that are addressed in that unit, and how does this lesson connect? What have students learned before? Where is this information going to be taken? Another key thing that I want to know is, I want to know specifically, what is the success criteria? What, as an observer, am I going to see or hear students do or say to illustrate that they've met that success criteria? The second big box, the purple box, is about answering that question about students. I always ask for a seating chart, and I use that seating chart, and I will illustrate that in the pre-conference. But I'm very clear about I want information and I want the teacher to use benchmark data for academics. I want them to tier the students for behavior. I want them to tell me about these students as learners and what can I expect the differentiation within the core to be to meet those different needs of students. And then finally, the last part is often connected to that teacher's professional goal, which is what am I specifically going to be observing? Now, just on a side note, these questions, they align with the essential questions of PLCs. So if you're working with a teacher who hasn't filled out this form for 3 years, I think it's important to make this connection because if you have PLCs, they should be engaging in these questions before every single unit, during every unit, and after. And really, these are the questions that we want teachers to be thinking about for every single lesson when they're sitting at the table doing that planning. But the more connections we can make so evaluation doesn't seem like this isolated process, the better. Okay, so the second routine for so you've, and I have to pop back here for a second. So everybody fills out this form. One of the features on our forms is we really tried to make the connections to the components that are associated with that offstage planning and prep to reinforce that this is an expectation all the time. The second thing is you have to read it before the conference. If you wait to read the pre-observation form during the conference, you're going to take 10 minutes. If you read this before the teacher comes into the conference, you already have an idea of what you're listening for and you know what questions you're going to ask for clarification. Have a schedule, have an organizer that you're going to fill out for the pre-conference. Some of the questions have already been answered. You could draw this, like print out their pre-observation reflection and just add these notes. But I'm going to suggest capturing this information because I'm going to show you how this connects to evidence collected, and then how this will connect to the teacher's reflection after the observation. So 4 minutes of time are spent clarifying. I've already read what the learning target is, but I am specifically listening and I have to know. So I'm going to go into the curriculum guide or map and I am really listening for what is the success criteria? Because I know I'm going to have to collect evidence and I'm going to want to know how many students, and I'm going to provide that back for the teacher, how many students met that success criteria by the end of the lesson. So I need to know that specifically. We're going to spend 5 minutes on the lesson plan and the instructional approaches that were selected because I want to start thinking about the teacher's planning process. Like, why are they deciding to use certain strategies and what do they expect is going to be the impact? We're going to spend 5 minutes with this seating chart. And you're going to see that over time, I started actually using a highlighter. And I would say, okay, talk to me through your 3 tiers in your classroom. What am I going to expect to see happening? What type of differentiation am I going to see to support student behavior and academic needs during this lesson? And then we would really clarify how I was going to collect the evidence that they wanted to see. So here's a picture of one of the seating charts, and I use the same seating chart in the pre-conference that I do to collect the evidence. So you can't just see one from the beginning, but you can see where in this classroom we had gone through and highlighted the different tiers for those students. And so that really gave me an idea. And then the teacher was able to say too, okay, here's how I support these different level of students in the classroom. So the second part of the pre-conference is, so we talked a lot about knowing who the students are, and we've gone through that agenda, but I really want to focus in on this second part of the reflective cycle. So part of it is knowing what the targets are, knowing who your students are, and knowing what the approaches are. And you use that information to then plan and deliver a lesson. So this is equally important in that pre-conference, is listening to the teacher talk through that planning process. And as the teacher is talking through the planning process, I'm already starting to anticipate, okay, here's some evidence I'm going to be collecting in these different areas. And so these are the components that I'm thinking about, like, I'm going to be, here's the learning target. What's the academic vocabulary that I'm going to hear the teacher using? Where are we might have a conversation about questioning and discussion techniques. My last 3 years evaluating, we were really focusing on gradual release. So a lot of our conversation was around how the teacher had planned for gradual release more than anything. And an important part of that is assessment and instruction. And so I always knew what those assessment points were that the teacher had planned out before they were going to go to the next phase. But this is twofold. Part of this is hearing the teacher talking through so I can start anticipating. And then I'm also going to be collecting that evidence then, right? That is supporting the implementation of that plan that that teacher had. And it is so important. And I don't know how clunky it felt to collect evidence, but I know when I worked with principals in Waverly the last 2 years, that was very uncomfortable. For principals to start collecting data, and that's normal. So it should feel uncomfortable at first because you're attending to a million things, and that's why I'm having you go back through these videos again and really think about, okay, what is a systematic way I can collect evidence? Part of it's just going to take practice and time, but the better, more reliable, the more valid you get, and systematic, then you're collecting that evidence and you can spend more of your energy on the analysis and assessment parts of the process. Okay, so I want you to see the connections between this pre-conference. And again, I'm doing this as a plug for the value of a pre-conference. Like, I really think that if you skip the pre-conference face-to-face meeting, you're missing out on a lot of opportunities to facilitate effective reflection and assessment. So if we look at this column right here, this is my pre-observation agenda, remember? And then what I'm doing is I'm listening and I'm filling out, I'm thinking about in that conference using the information from the form and what the teacher is saying. And you don't have to rewrite this out. You already have it written down in the reflection. So you can just take notes on that. But I'm listening to the answers to these questions, and the teacher essentially is setting up or directing the evidence collection. So the teacher is telling me what the plan is and what he or she is anticipating the impact to be. And then what I'm going to do during the observation is I'm going to collect data to connect to these things. So, like, let's take this one. We'll take the learning target and success criteria. So, the teacher is going to tell me ahead of time what the target is, how it fits into the unit, and what the success criteria is. So then when I'm in the lesson, I'm going to be listening as if I was a student. And I'm going to be taking down evidence, verbatim quote what the teacher said, what vocabulary they used, how they explained the vocabulary, so I can provide evidence to the teacher. If I were a student in this class, would I know what the target is? The other thing that I'm setting up in that pre-conference and reading about this is I need to know exactly what I'm looking for students to say or do so I can provide evidence to the teacher by the end how many of the students in that class met that success criteria. And if I can give descriptive information about maybe they met 2, but not this one, or this one met 4 and not this, that's even better. Here's another example. With the lesson plan, the teacher is going through and I'm taking notes on that lesson plan or on that, really thinking about, okay, this is what I'm going to expect in that classroom. And then I'm time stamping and I'm going through. So then at the end of the observation, I can assess, the teacher can assess how close did that lesson implementation meet the plan that was laid out. I could also, like maybe it's engagement of students during different phases. So I might be collecting that data as well. So I can connect that back to that portion. So I want you to start to see how critical this pre-observation meeting is in setting up that collection of evidence. And then your job is to collect the evidence to then go back and inform the reflection. Here's an example of, this was a permanent teacher, and there were 3 tasks in the class. And so the teacher wanted me to, I checked off if the student successfully completed the task and met the success criteria. I put an X next to the student if they did not. So the check mark meant that they successfully completed it. The X's meant that they did not meet that one, and there were 3. On this evidence collector, and I used like time stamping as well. But we also were looking at positive, like reinforcing to corrective. And there wasn't a lot of feedback. This in terms of behavior expectations, because this teacher had such a well-run classroom and kids were really engaged in the tasks that the teacher had presented. Okay, so we've talked about how that pre-conference sets up the evidence collection, and I'm going to reiterate again then that importance. The evidence is that foundation, and it's the foundation for the self-assessment and reflection. It's also the foundation for the assessment of practice and feedback. So that's that next phase, is the ability to accurately assess practice. And so the teacher does that through the self-assessment. And that's ultimately what we want, is teachers to be able to accurately self-assess and adjust their own teaching practices. But we also have to be able to do that as evaluators. And so the post-observation reflection meeting and the observations are really critical in that assessment practice. But again, you have to have evidence in order to move into this section of reflection. And so the teacher is generating part of that evidence, as I explained in the last slide, and then the evaluator is also generating evidence. And this is a partnership. So both bodies of evidence are going to inform the assessment of practice. So this is what we're going to get into more next week when we start talking about structuring framework. But I want you to look at how I've dropped the teacher generated evidence, and I still have this same frame of pre-observation. And now we have this evidence that's been collected by the evaluator, and we want to give that to the teacher before they complete their self-assessment. So I would always email my my collection, evidence collector, and the seating chart to the teacher so they could take a look at that. And then the teacher is going to complete that self-assessment of practice and fill out that form based on what they were seeing in the classroom. We also, though, we want to present them evidence that we were collecting objectively during the observation for them to use in that self-assessment. And then the final part is that capacity to adjust actions. And we are not going to talk about this portion or this part of the component because that comes after self-assessment and feedback. Um, so, um, so that is getting more in depth and really reinforcing the importance of evidence. And I want to come back to the elephant in the room, which is this challenge, which I imagine you felt. I only had you collect evidence on one component on the videos that you watched. When you're in person and you have the expectation that you have to rate teachers on every single aspect of their performance, you have to provide them with detailed feedback on everything. And this all has to happen in one single class period. It's very unrealistic and it's inefficient in even changing practice to try to take on every single component. And I've told you this many times. One of the things I really hope that you take away from this class and this course is just a lifelong commitment to the evaluation process and the belief that evaluation really is a tool to support teachers in continuous improvement of their practice. So, in order to overcome this challenge, you have to build good habits as an evaluator and you have to be strategic. So, strategy number one is an extension of last week, which is you got to come up with systems and routines to effectively collect evidence. Um, when we talked about evidence, I just started to peek at some of the evidence collected from Module 5, and so I don't have enough, but the feedback I'm going to give is really be specific in your evidence. The more you can quote and quantify, the better. Um, and um, and yes, you're going to be looking at teacher actions, but this week I really want you, as much as you can, to provide evidence and support that content. Like, what are the tasks that students are being asked to complete? What is that depth of knowledge level? How much of the task is the student doing on their own? How much is the teacher doing for them? And really describing students as well. We talked about you are again going to be collecting evidence from formal and informal observations. But this week we added evidence that you can bring about planning and preparing knowledge of students from a pre-conference. And then next week, we're going to start looking at what evidence you can derive from a self-assessment. Um, Last week I went through domain 2. So this week I'm going to model how you can set up systems using domain 3. So this is my cheat sheet for domain 3. This is absolutely everything. And it's very overwhelming, but it's everything. And I've done it enough. I've been evaluating for 13 years that I am pretty efficient in gathering data from all 5 of these components. But I want to practice what I'm teaching. So the first thing you're going to do is identify what data you're going to collect for each component during every observation and how you will collect it. So you're going to be doing this for the opposite domain that you did last week. And so here's an example of what I would be focusing in on right now in Waverly or at Dawes in domain 3. I really am looking for the vocabulary that's taught and the vocabulary that's used. And I'm also interested in how often students are using the academic vocabulary during a lesson. I am very curious and interested in the opportunities that students have to respond and process information in the class and how they're being asked to do that. I'm always going to gather information about gradual release and lesson design. And then in terms of assessment, I want to know what that criteria is. And I'm specifically going to be giving information about how many kids are getting feedback and what kind. I'm going to show you where this came from. So in Dawes, we had identified these as our core practices as a school. And teachers and teams could identify their professional goal. It could be anything on this page, but it had to be within that. And then this is the gradual release matrix that I use to help me to summarize the practices that I'm seeing and write my informal and formal um, assessment practice frames. I got better at collecting evidence. Here's some of the quantitative data that I collect around domain 3. So I'm going to summarize for teachers how many minutes that they're spending in each phase of gradual release. And then within each phase of gradual release, I'm going to be really specific about what students were doing. um, if the classroom is in guided practice, I'm going to be really specific of how much I'm going to be giving some feedback to the teachers and collecting evidence about the number of students that got feedback and how they got feedback. So this tool helped me to narrow what quantitative information I'm going to give teachers, or data I'm going to be collecting, and what qualitative data I'm going to be collecting. But I want to give a balance of both. The second part of this strategy is to develop a process or system for collecting the evidence and stick with it. And so just to plug, leverage the pre-conference. So you can use that pre-conference to load and direct your evidence collection. And I would write out these things. I always printed the pre-conference form and I wrote on that, and I put that in my evidence collection folder. And then I marked up the seating chart and I collected some of the evidence on the seating chart as well. And don't do 2 evidence collection methods until you've mastered one. Here is an example of these are the 2. I would use these simultaneously. And so I used this system on the left to provide me with the timestamp. And that was important for 2 reasons. It was so I could give information about the amount of time in each phase of gradual release. It also helped me to triangulate data. So if there were a lot of management issues, we were able to look at what time that was at and then go into engaging students in learning. Don't worry about that. We're going to get into that next week with analysis and assessment. But I wanted you to see that this also was always more teacher driven. It was always hard for me to collect student evidence in this evidence collector. This is where I really got this student information. So this was student focused. I also think the seating chart really supports work in equity because it provides a visual representation of what's happening in the classroom, what students are answering questions, which students are getting feedback. And it really does focus more on students. And this is where I would always do the focused evidence. So whatever the teacher identified, I would provide that on the seating chart. So again, I did both, but I had years of this and mastered this collection process before I added the student focused. Okay, and then you need to develop frames to summarize the evidence. So the worst thing to do is like get stuck and then not get the evidence to the teacher for 3 days. I read that in some of your evaluations of components is feedback's awesome when it's timely. So you want to be able to provide evidence to a teacher, and you want that wrapped up as soon as possible. So the best way to do that is to develop frames that you can use. So I work with a principal, and he actually has frames for every component, and then he copies and pastes it and he puts the teacher's information in it. And for a while he felt bad about doing that, and I encouraged him to use the frames, because it's consistently reinforcing the teaching practices, and it's individualized because it's the teacher's data. So this would be a frame that could be used for a formal observation. And so this is not the feedback. This is only a summary. Okay. So this is not feedback. It's only a summary. You're presenting the evidence. And so for this, you are going to provide information about the learning target and success criteria, use of instructional strategies, and student outcomes observed. So as you can see here, my frame here starts with what the learning target is. And I always would include how many chunks and for how much time. Then I got into each phase of gradual release, and I was very specific about certain strategies that I provided information in about, like what was happening in that phase. And then I would always close that summary of practice with how many students met the success criteria for the lesson. So this is an example of a frame that you could use to summarize the practices. You could also create a frame that actually summarizes classroom environment, summarizes instruction, and then summarizes the success criteria for students. This is another frame that I use for informal observations, and it's a positive frame. So it's recognizing specific practices, and it's to be used in a positive manner. So you're starting off with a courtesy statement. You're describing the teaching practice, and you're connecting that to the strategy or the principle. So you're naming it. This reinforces, sometimes teachers are using strategies and they don't know the name of it. So you're reinforcing the strategy. You're connecting it to how it impacts student learning. So you're connecting it to the learning. That increases the likelihood of the teacher repeating the strategy. And then you're ending with a positive tag. So here's what this would look like in the classroom. You use a verb teaching action, so provided 8 positive praise statements and had no redirections during the 13-minute window of observation. This one, I didn't name the principle because the principle was in the teaching statement. They were using reinforcing expected behaviors. So I could have added, this is called reinforcing expected behaviors. And then how does that connect to learning? When you praise students, you reinforce both academic and behavioral expectations. Continue to provide positive praise for students. I use my matrices that have that, and I've uploaded those in the folders, and I tell principals to use those because those matrices or strategy matrices, they include the success criteria, they include the name of the principal, and they include the impact on instruction. And so you can have that with you, and you can use those as you develop your own frames. And then some people just copy and paste. The final strategy is to be strategic with your data collection. And this really connects to finding number 2, which is putting our observation rubrics on a diet. And so I just want to connect this to some of the things I've been reading in your own evaluation practices. And so I think that here are 4 main approaches to being strategic. So one thing you could do is just focus your collection different for probationary teachers. So you can use that evaluation period to strategically start building specific practices. And one of the students in this class is from Elkhorn, and his description is that Elkhorn provides professional learning to new teachers about the instructional model, the Elkhorn instructional model, and then the principal is providing evidence and feedback to those components of the model. We are implementing in District 145 a new teacher program, and we focused first quarter on classroom environment and what the expectations are. And so we were strategic in giving evidence and leading instructional rounds for teachers to really get that practice solidified. Then we're moving on to planning and preparation. And so we're aligning our evidence collection to the mastery of specific teaching practices. Another approach would be just teacher professional goals. So going in and looking at what that teacher is working on or keeping something and always providing feedback to that. A lot of you suggested that and recommended it. It was unclear to me if any districts really are practicing this strategically. The third is connecting to your school or district continuous improvement action plan. And we did this at Dawes. I've illustrated for you how we use those core practices, and that's what we would center our evidence collection around. A couple of you talked about how LPS does this with learning targets, that's a real priority. So every informal observation is going to provide feedback and evidence to that. A final approach might be a curriculum or pedagogical implementation. And so Shickley teachers are learning about letter strategies. And so then to reinforce the implementation of that, evaluators can give feedback to those strategies. The principal at the intermediate school during the CKLA implementation for 2 years collected evidence for teachers and evaluation around CKLA implementation. Finally, I just want to leave you with, remember, this is a growth-oriented process. So it's not an event, and it takes a long time to build your evaluation process. And so that's what we're doing. And that's the goal of this course is to get you thinking about all of these components and to start developing some systems to support those rituals and those habits of effective evaluation. A well-implemented evaluation system is really built upon a series of systems. And it takes commitment every year to those systems to really support ongoing and effective evaluation. So this week's assignments is very similar to last week. I want you to use your district's framework. And we're really working to reinforce strategy number 1, which is establishing systems and routines to collect evidence. So you're really focusing on evidence collection. You're going to use a different domain from last week. Please use one of the on-stage domains because you're collecting evidence in a classroom observation. You're going to develop a matrix using the process that was outlined in module number 3. You'll identify and clarify that specific evidence you're going to collect, and you can connect that to your school or your personal priorities. Make sure you're indicating what that is so that's obvious. So include why you're prioritizing that evidence. And then select or develop, use maybe the same evidence collector that you used, and collect evidence from the same 2 videos. You can select 2 different ones if you want to, but I encourage you use that same video. And then write a statement summarizing the evidence you collected using the same observation frame for both, and use a specific language to describe those practices. And then the final part of the assignment is a reflection. So our purpose in this module is to continue to develop your skills and practice. So I want you to describe how and why you revised your evidence collecting process this week. That's everything for module number 6. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.